Hey YouTube, I've got a bit of news. I'm afraid I am going to be out of touch for a little while. Prudence compels me not to share any details about what I'll be doing now or when I get back. But I will be back, and at that time I should have a new camera, a better microphone, and better editing software. In the meantime, I know of no greater compliment than those 6 little words, "You give me cause to think." To that end, let me take one parting shot at having such an effect. An interesting phenomenon I've noticed is the tendency for someone to adopt the wrong focus in making an argument. For example, I once encountered the argument that, since male college students tend to have a more visual learning style and female college students tend to have a more verbal learning style, maybe it would be a good idea to have male and female college students going to class separately. I glean a number of problems with this particular example. First, the key difference is not gender, but learning style. So if a society is going to take such a step, surely it would be better to sort students on that basis. Yes, male students tend to have more of a visual style, while most female students tend to have a more verbal style. But this is the tendency, not the rule. What about that minority of female students who are more visual, and that minority of male students who are more verbal? Does it make sense to require each of them to remain in a class oriented to work with a style that doesn't suit them so well just because of their gender? Doesn't that miss the point? Second, what about the occasional odd student whose gender isn't so neatly categorized? That is, what about the occasional student who in some ways is distinctly male and in other ways is distinctly female? There are such students. A lot of us find this an uncomfortable fact to face, and so when given the option, opt not to. But this doesn't get rid of the uncomfortable fact. With regard to those who can be so described, which side of this divide would you place them on? Third, this induction overlooks 2 very important facts. For one, even the most visual among us have some verbal skills, and even the most verbal among us have some visual skills. For the other, however good or bad one's skills in either respect, those skills can be developed. One who wishes to develop one's verbal skills can spend the time listening to segments of a recorded story and then paraphrasing them. One who wishes to develop one's visual skills can spend the time watching a nature program with the sound off. Given the incredible utility of both sets of skills, don't we do better by our college students by challenging them to develop a high degree of aptitude in both? Fourth, when together, do the 2 styles necessarily conflict? Is time spent relying on one not available for the other? Can't the 2 reinforce one another? Isn't it possible that each individual student is aided in his or her efforts to understand something if that something is presented both visually and verbally when possible? Fifth, what about the other ways in which learning styles can differ? There's also competitive versus collaborative, structured versus unstructured, spatial versus verbal, practical versus creative, applied versus conceptual, factual versus analytical, and emotional versus logical. Do you advocate dividing the students along each of these lines as well? Another misdirected focus I observed recently in a video by a YouTube Buddhist. This video I found quite amusing, contrary to his intention. In the video, he described a Buddhist ceremony I don't remember the name for. Apparently this ceremony entails a Buddhist item called, as I recall, a mala. Any Buddhist who happens to see this, I recommend if you mention this item in the presence of a Muslim, be prepared to sort out some confusion. Anyhow, a mala apparently is the Buddhist equivalent to a rosary. He explained that there are 2 kinds of malas, one for men and one for women. He was then very quick to explain that although that may seem sexist, this difference is very important. Given that 9 times out of 10 men have thicker fingers than women, the mala for men has larger beads, which are difficult for people with more slender fingers to work with. By the same token, 9 times out of 10, women have more slender fingers than men, so the mala for women has smaller beads, which are difficult for people with very thick fingers to work with. So in other words, the important difference is finger size. So why is the focus here on gender instead? Would it not make more sense to sort them into malas for people with thicker fingers and malas for people with more slender fingers? Why be content to accommodate 9 out of 10 when with nothing but a slight change in one's choice of words, one can accommodate all 10? Would that not make more sense? I might also point out Sorting something on the basis of gender is hardly in and of itself sexist. After all, few in society have any misgivings about having men and women using After all, few in society have any misgivings about having men and women using different restrooms, or wearing different underwear. Any supermarket in the first world is bound to have a section for feminine hygiene products, and I have yet to hear any allegations of sexism in response to that. In the physical fitness test for the U.S. Marines, although there can be additional details depending on one's area of expertise, men are tested on the number of pull-ups they can perform, while women are tested on the length of time they can keep their chin above the bar. I don't know the reason for this, but it hardly strikes me as sexist, though I recognize that some may disagree. Now let me make a few comments about gender differences that I have the audacity to regard as quite removed from sexism. First, one may note that lines tend to form at the ladies' room more often than at the men's. One reason for this, I dare to say, is that the average woman is more likely to consume a healthy amount of water. Another is bladder size. Because men have our reproductive organs on the outside, there's more room inside for the bladder. I would even hazard a guess that another reason is the tendency of women to enjoy gossiping with friends. Second, one day at work, I said to one of my female coworkers, "I don't know what value you attach to my opinion, but that is a very pleasant scent." It was about that time that she started calling me sweetie pie. Now, I will be the first to admit that there's a lot to women I don't understand, but I dare to say that I know them well enough to conclude that smell is a much greater part of the average woman's world than the average man's, and that the reason for this is that the average woman's sense of smell is about twice as strong. It's for this, I dare to say, that women are more likely not just to try to get rid of an unpleasant scent, but to actually try to adopt a pleasant scent. This, I'm also certain, is why a woman is more likely to appreciate it when someone compliments her on the way she smells, especially guys, since guys having a weaker sense of smell are about half as likely to notice. Observe that it's hardly offensive or sexist to comment on the differences between men and women. It doesn't become sexist until one starts using this as a basis to argue that the opinions of one matter more than the opinions of the other. But back to the subject. Another misdirected focus, or at least seeming misdirected focus, was pointed out to me in an argument I recently encountered about affirmative action. Being hard-pressed to disagree, I am compelled to adopt this position, though if anyone has a counter-argument, or can point to a problem with this one, please feel free to make use of the comments. It's true. I will not deny it. I freely acknowledge and regret that, at least in the United States, ethnic minorities receive disproportionately heavy representation among the lower tax brackets and disproportionately light representation among the higher ones. But they receive some representation in each tax bracket. So it doesn't make sense to give those in the higher ones the same amount and the same kind of assistance one gives those in the lower ones. We've all seen the occasional homeless black man pushing a shopping cart. Does he need assistance? Of course. But why? Because he's black? No. He needs assistance because he's poor. If you're going to give him assistance because he's black, then you might as well give the same assistance to the likes of Tiger Woods, Michael Jordan, and the Williams sisters. But that doesn't make any sense at all because they obviously don't need it. Meanwhile, what about people in lower tax brackets who happen to be Caucasian? Do they need less assistance for that reason? Of course not. The United States of America is supposed to be a republic. That is a national scale democracy. Having a democracy depends on having a strong, robust middle class. When you lose your middle class, you lose your democracy. One who appreciates living in a republic has it in his or her own best interest to favor steps to keep that republic strong and robust by keeping its middle class in the same condition. Keeping our middle class strong is in all of our best interests, no matter our ethnic group. The thinning of the middle class is a threat to democracy and therefore a bad harbinger for all of us, no matter our ethnic group. Therefore, it is in all of our best interests, no matter our ethnic group, to maintain a system in which most find it doable, though not necessarily easy, to climb into the middle class, and relatively difficult, though not impossible, to climb above it and stay there, difficult enough that most find it more trouble than it's worth. To this end, I think affirmative action should be oriented toward tax bracket, not ethnic group.